Well, we're going to go start with some announcements before the program. If you have not grabbed some food and something to drink, please do that. Also, books are being sold in the hallway right outside. And the all-important information, if you need the restroom at any point, you take a right outside of these back doors, and they're by the elevators. Parking. If you parked in our parking garage, and I hear it's full, so I think some of you did, make sure you get a voucher. If you did not get one on the way in, make sure you get a voucher. You just scan your ticket and then that voucher, and that gives you a free exit from our parking garage. Questions during the activity, during the conversation. If you have a question, you can write it down on the card, and this is so that we can get through as many as possible. This is a short period of time to go through a big topic, and so we want it to get to those as many questions as possible. If you run out of cards at your table, by all means, just flag someone down, and we'll get you some more. If you do have a question you want asked, just raise it up, and we'll have somebody come by, pick it up, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Okay. I want to go over, so this is part of, obviously we're here for a few different reasons, but a big one is the completion of Oklahoma Justice, which chronicles the state trial of Terry Nichols by Bob Burke and Nolan Clay. And we're very excited about this edition, and I think that it's... I read it last month, and it is, I think, a very much needed book, and so excited to have it. This is part of our Better Conversation series, and I think our Better Conversation series is based off of a framework we created with a really audacious goal, and that is that by having conversations, including about tough topics, even with people you don't agree with, that we can move the needle on moving people to a place where we're preventing things like what happened in 1995. And so we encourage you to take to heart our grounding virtues and invite someone into a conversation, including somebody where you might not know where they stand on an issue, because that is the only way where we can build understanding across divides. So our grounding virtues of words that matter, hospitality, humility, patience, generous listening, and adventurous civility will ground our conversation here. But if we don't take those out into our own spaces, then we're not going to move the needle, right? And so we have to practice and continue practicing having better conversations to make a difference. Okay. And so with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage, and we'll get started here in just a minute.
Here we are again.
Once again.
It's really good to see you.
See you.
Where in Mexico?
Just outside of Albuquerque, it's called Corrales.
When did you move there?
Well, I moved to New Mexico in, I think it was 2001. Lived in Santa Fe, and then
So during the trial, you were.
I was in. I moved right after that. Oh, Bob, hi, nice to see you. Yeah, nice to see you.
Right there. All right. As with any program we do, we always want to remember why we are here, and so let us join together. We come here to remember those who were killed, those who survived, and those changed forever. May all who leave here know the impact of violence. May this memorial offer comfort, strength, peace, hope, and serenity. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We are nearing the end of our 168 days of remembrance, and every single day in that time period, we remember someone who was killed, as well as honoring those who survived and thanking those changed forever. Today we remember Sharon Louise Wood Chestnut, who, an Oklahoma City native, grew up in the Del City area, and later returned after a short stint in Louisiana to her hometown to work in the Social Security office. And so today we remember Sharon Louise. Okay, joining me and so my name is, I do a terrible job of introducing myself, don't I? My name is Stephen Evans. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programming here. I am so glad to see a full room for this event, and we are doing these Better Conversation lunch events once a month, and so I hope that you continue to join us as we try to dive into some important and tough topics. So joining me as a moderator is Jenny. If Jenny will head up to the front for me. Jenny, as many of you probably know, is the Vice President of Oklahoma Hall of Fame and was the series editor of this book. And so we're excited to have Jenny up here with us. And we'll be kind of going back and forth, playing off each other as we take questions and with the panel. On our esteemed panel, Justice Taylor, who was the presiding judge at the state trial, also memorial chairman from 2018 to 2019, and we're very fortunate to have his leadership and continued support at this institution. Nolan Clay, co-author of Oklahoma Justice, a journalist at the Oklahoman for a number of years, and maybe the most knowledgeable journalist on the stories associated with the bombing. 40 years. That's hard to believe. He must have started when he was in diapers. Bob Burke. On the back of the book, it has on Bob's bio, it says he has written more nonfiction books than anyone in history, and that is quite the thing to put into print. Bob, a lawyer and prolific author and co-author of Oklahoma Justice. Very excited to have Bob here. And then all the way from New Mexico, Pat Lopez, who today spends a lot of her time working as an art therapist, but is perhaps better known as a courtroom artist. One of, I guess, a dying breed in a way, but one of the most prominent courtroom artists and very much a part of the story of the trials. And so if you would, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists.
And Stephen, you'll learn in the book that she's really an Okie.
Okay. Jenny, would you like to kick us off?
I would love to. Our first question is for Bob Burke. You have authored 2 titles related to the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building and the subsequent prosecutions, each from very different primary sources. How were the sources similar or different, and how did they impact the written preservation of this chapter of our history?
Well, 4 years after the bombing, the 2 FBI agents who literally led the investigation in Oklahoma and in Kansas, and I co-authored Simple Truths, which is the story about the investigation, okay? And so the sources then, well, the state trial was going on, right, Judge, at the time when we wrote that book. And so the FBI delivers to my house 30,000 documents that had been used in Denver and other places, okay? And I had to sign my life away. I'm telling you, I couldn't tell anybody they were there. And we used a lot of those in that first book and in this book too. So the sources there, in fact, it's so interesting on history because Janet Reno was the Attorney General at the time. And I said from the beginning, I'm a lawyer. There are a lot of rumors out here that there were more people besides Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols involved in this, so I'm going to keep an open mind about it. I concluded without question that it's the only 2 guys. I believe that, far beyond a reasonable doubt. The second thing, though, is that the proofreader assigned by the Department of Justice at the time and the Assistant Attorney General, who became the liaison with the FBI in the investigation, was a lawyer at DOJ named Merrick Garland, who has just concluded a term as Attorney General of the United States. Anyway, now, this time, I'm so honored to work with Nolan, who I have deep regard for his writing for 40 years. I've been practicing law since right after the Civil War, and Nolan was writing for the Appomattox Journal right after the Civil War. No. We've been in a lot of territory, but my great honor is working with Nolan in this case because I have deep regard for him. Well, in the sources, he spent the spring and summer of 21 years ago in McAllister. I mean, literally got an apartment there and stayed there. And so in this process, it's a totally, I had the FBI as the source the first time and other sources. But this time, Nolan did a lot of interviews with people. Since the bombing, the memorial has done a lot of interviews with people. And then I got to interview Pat on the telephone and found out she was from Midwest City, and learned to draw here in Oklahoma City. And she donated all of the paintings to the memorial, all of the sketches, drawings, and so we were able to use those in the book, which I think adds so much to it. So it's so neat to meet you here today. But working with Nolan, and I've known, it's hard to call him Judge because I call him Justice Taylor, and I've known him since he had a full head of black hair, and that was some years ago, okay? For many years, Jenny, as you know, he and I volunteered behind the stage at the annual Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Now, you did it for 40 years, I bet, but I helped you some of those years. But anyway, so I've known him long time before he was ever involved in this trial. And what's unique about the source, Nolan, and this is cool, you and I have talked about it, because Nolan and I have met a lot of times in my office. We both love cheese and crackers. So I always made sure when we're editing, we always had lots of cheese and crackers. We prefer the Ritz brand. I don't know if I can. Maybe they send us a box of those. But Justice Taylor gave us his diary. Okay, so in this book you'll learn what he was thinking at night. Boy, this is a burden upon me. The night he lost sleep when the Chief Justice called and said, can I come down and talk to you? He didn't know if he was going to be disbarred or what. He didn't tell him why he was coming. But he was chosen as a very well-respected, highly respected district judge in the state to try this case, out of Oklahoma City, of course. Anyway, but I'm just very honored to be part of it. But we had not only the bench notes from Judge Taylor, Justice Taylor, but his diary. Never written a book where I had somebody's diary.
Wow. So one thing that I learned from this book and from all of those sources, and I was not in Oklahoma at the time, and so I was completely unaware of this, but some of you probably remember. There was a lot of public opposition to holding this trial. And I don't know why that surprised me with, you talk about the price tag. But Justice Taylor, I'm wondering if you can speak to this, because you seem to be, at least how it reads in the book to me, you were pretty convinced that there needed to be a trial. And so I'm wondering how you reached that conclusion, if you still feel like, this was necessary.
Well, it wasn't my decision to make. In fact, I had already been assigned by the Supreme Court to try this case, and so I purposely did not express any view or opinion about whether or not there would be a state trial, because that was totally up to Wes Lane, the district attorney at the time, the state district attorney for Oklahoma County. The public, I observed it all and watched it take place, but did not weigh in one way or another. It would have been improper for me to do that as the assigned trial judge. The public opposition was purely well, not completely, but to a great extent, centered on the cost. The two defendants, McVeigh and Nichols, had already been tried in federal court. Both had been found guilty. Both had received their sentencing. And so the thought was, why do we need to have a state trial? Why spend the money to try this case on the state level? Wes Lane is not here, and I hesitate to speak for him, but I think I can put myself in his shoes, and I've talked to him about this since. You put yourself in his shoes. There were 160 murder cases sitting on his desk. Mm-hmm. And you stop and think about it. You know, when you're a district attorney and you have one first-degree murder case sitting on your desk, it gets your attention, and you want to do your best to engage that case in a trial. Wes Lane had 160 murder cases sitting on his desk that had not been tried, the 160 civilians who were killed. The 8 federal officers who were killed were the subject of the federal trial. But he had 160 civilian murder cases on his desk. And he felt an obligation as the elected district attorney to do what you do, and that is prosecute the murder cases that are sitting on your desk that have been investigated and referred to you for trial. So that's the decision he made. And as I say, not to speak for him if he were here, but I think if he were here, he would say, you can't put a price tag on justice. You can't say, well, we can't afford, we're not going to spend the money on these cases. Well, when you start doing that, particularly with murder cases, you know, what does justice mean if you go to the cash register to make the decision on whether or not to try 160 murder cases? So if Wes were here, I think that's generally what he would say. I respect the decision he made. I didn't weigh in on it, but I respect the decision he made. And I said after this trial was over that I think he made the right decision. So, you know, selfishly, it would have saved me a whole year of my life, you know, dedicated to this trial. But that was not my concern. My concern was that there be a fair trial.
Ms. Lopez, first, thank you. Thank you for your work that has really brought this book to life. But let me ask you this. For many, your drawings were the only window into what was happening during the proceedings in McAllister. Each morning, how did you decide what you were going to depict and how you were going to depict it for that day?
Well, I couldn't know until I was in the room. At that point, I'd been a courtroom artist for close to 20 years and have covered many, many trials all across the nation. But this one was really hit home. My family was in Oklahoma City, and my sister was across the street at a building when the bomb went off. I didn't even know if she was alive yet until the end of the day. But to answer your question, I can't know what I'm going to draw until I'm in the room, until something happens. It's like a sense. You're waiting with your pencils and paper, and then I have to look around and constantly observe and feel what's happening in the room. It's like an energy, and Judge, you would know that energy because you surveyed the room many times during the trial, and I know that there were times that there were some people there that shouldn't have been there. That's what I'm talking about. It's something that you have to build inside as not only an artist, but a person who has a stake in this. I wasn't just there to do my job. I was there to help see that justice was done. That's why I was careful with my drawings and made sure that they told the truth for that moment. So whatever it was, I'd have to catch it in a flash and then run it downstairs to tape it to the outside of the building because Judge wouldn't let him come inside the courthouse. So that was how that happened.
And let me just say that, you know, I had a vantage point to answer your question, Jenny. I had a vantage point. I'm sitting there on the bench, and I've got this whole courtroom and everything that's going on in the courtroom and trying to make sure that there is order and fairness and maintain the dignity of the courtroom. I gave Pat a front row seat and gave her room to have her supplies, her drawing supplies. And so from time to time, I couldn't help but look over at her as I was sitting up on the bench, because, ladies and gentlemen, it was amazing how this lady could, I had ruled that cameras can't be in the courtroom. Well, there was a camera in the courtroom. Her name was Pat Lopez, and I couldn't help but watch her, and she would pull these color pencils out and the big sheet of paper. The paper was huge that she was drawing on, and literally in 45 minutes, I would watch her, and in 45 minutes she would have a drawing and depict as if there'd been a photograph. And she did several a day for 4 months. And I don't know what we would do here at the museum without her drawings to tell
Thank you,
this
sir.
story.
Yeah. And I think it's cool, Pat. Then you had to take them downstairs. Then the network cameras and the still photographers, you pinned it. You describe that process.
I taped it to the concrete wall next to the doorway, and then I had to step aside, and there was like, I don't know how many cameras there were out there, like a whole ring of cameras. They'd all take turns, still photographers and video photographers, and they would shoot the drawing, and then they'd do what they needed to do with it. And I'd be going around to the people behind the scenes, the producers, and saying, now remember, Pat Lopez, artwork, Pat Lopez. Because they'd forget the credit, But that wasn't why. The most important thing is that it was my honor to be there. Half the time when I was there, I didn't have a payment. I had to be there to see this trial through. Now, I did work at various times for CNN and ABC during the process, but it was more important that the images got out there.
If you allow me, Pat, to follow up, this was maybe I'm overstepping here, but it sounds like it was a little more personal than some of your other high-profile cases. And so, as a recording history, objectively recording history, was it difficult to separate those feelings?
It was at times, yes. But had I not been in that business for 20 years beforehand, I don't know that I could have made it through. It was difficult at times. But you soldier on. You do what you need to do for the moment, because there were millions of people out there waiting to hear the truth of that story. And I could not distort it in any way. So that kept me focused. But thank you for your question.
Nolan, so having covered so much of this story, was there something different about the state trial than your previous reporting?
Well, thank you for asking. And, I first didn't want to do this book. I did so in large part because I have respect for Justice Taylor. And the reason I didn't want to do this book at first, because I had bought into the prosecution's purpose, which was to get the death penalty. But as I revisited the whole case, and I came to realize that there was another purpose. The other purpose was to bring solace to those families who had lost so much. They talked at the time, and I wrote it down, but as I revisited doing this book with Bob, that came front and center, that these people finally, as Justice Taylor said, their loved ones were recognized, and they had you never have closure, but they had some solace, some relief that there was a murder conviction for their loved ones. And that made this trial special. And I'm glad I did the book, because that brought it home. Because I was just so, prosecutors, Bob Macy wanted the death penalty. The 3 prosecutors who were there, they were so disappointed that the death penalty was not given. But in some ways, as Justice Taylor heard from some of the jurors, Nichols' punishment was worse. He has to live with what he did every day. And on that thought, and I've said this before, nobody's the villain of their own story. McVeigh thought he was right. He viewed himself as comparable to the Boston Tea Party people, that he was going to start a revolution against the government. And he was striking back at the government. Nichols was worse. McVeigh was a little crazy. I mean, that wasn't ever going to happen. Nichols was worse. He was a grown man. McVeigh was a young man. Nichols was a grown man. He did it out of his hatred for the government. And 30 years ago today was Easter Sunday. And Nichols had gone with his wife to church. And then he followed McVeigh down so they could plant the getaway car so they could blow up the building. If that's not more evil than anything,
Yeah.
it just brings it home.
Nolan, let me follow up on that a little bit. And Bob referenced it earlier about the unique access you had. In McAllister, you relocated there, you became a part of the community. How did that access impact either negatively and or positively in your writing and the story that you were telling?
Well, I'd covered the McVeigh's federal trial, Nichols' federal trial, Nichols' preliminary hearing, McVeigh's execution. But
You were a witness to that execution.
yes,
Yeah.
but this trial, I mean, he was a judge then. Judge Taylor was very accessible, and he started doing jury selection. We were all kicked out, and I called him up that night. I think I sent you an email too, and said, "Hey, let us in one at a time, and because the jury selection is important."
Let me. Nolan made state legal history because we were doing individual voir dire, and the lawyers and the judges here in the room know that individual voir dire is done back in chambers in the judges' chambers, outside the hearing of the gallery or the press or anybody. And I'm sitting at home the first night after the individual voir dire, and I get a email and then a phone call from Nolan, and he says, "Judge, I've got this idea." And I said, "What? What, Nolan?" And he said, "Would you let us have a pool reporter in the chambers when you're doing the individual voir dire, and then have that pool reporter report back to the other 30-some reporters out in the hallway?" And I said, "Let me think about it." I thought about it, and I think I called him back that night or whatever, but I said yes. It's because I wanted everybody. It was important that this be a fair trial, but just as importantly, it was important that this be perceived as a fair trial by the citizens of Oklahoma. And I thought Nolan's idea is perfect. Let a pool reporter in there so that the folks can read in the Oklahoman and all the other news sources what's happening behind closed doors. And that's what we did. And so Nolan made history.
Of course, it helps that he's such a news hound that he's willing to talk to reporters. I mean, I talked to Judge Maish, the federal judge, once. The judge who sentenced Michael Fortier, I had lunch with him.
Oh, okay.
But I had great access, complete access to Judge Taylor.
I trusted Nolan. I knew that I trusted. That's the important thing. When I said off the record, I could trust him. When I said background, I could trust him. And my aim in giving him information was, again, I wanted people to understand what was going on in the courtroom so that they would appreciate that the fair trial is taking place. And so when we were doing something that needed a little background information, I could give it to Nolan on background or off the record, so that there would be an understanding by the readers of what's happening in the courtroom. And it wouldn't be just legal mumbo jumbo. It would be, he could explain it.
Now, Jenny, I believe you had a question about that jury selection. You want to throw that one out there?
Justice Taylor, the selection of a jury and alternates is so important in all legal proceedings. This trial was no different. Can you talk a little bit about how those alternates came into play, how close you were to losing your alternates, and some of the accommodations you had to make?
Okay.
You got to tell the story about the couch in
I
your
understand.
office.
Okay. Good. Everybody's had lunch. Well, jury selection. I was a trial judge for 20 years. Tried over 500 jury trials and thousands of other trials, but jury selection is critically important to a fair trial. If you fail there, then everything else is downhill. If you fail to get a fair and impartial jury, then it doesn't make any difference what happens after that. Right, Judge? So if you can imagine trying to pick a fair and impartial jury in the Oklahoma City bombing case in McAlester, Oklahoma, or any place in Oklahoma, it was a daunting task. It took us about 3 weeks, but we got a fair jury. We picked 18 jurors. I had to start off, normally in a first-degree murder case, I would summon 150 jurors to the courthouse to begin jury selection. In this case, I summoned 1,000 jurors. We couldn't put them at the courthouse, so we had to move the beginning of the jury selection to the McAlester High School auditorium that would seat 1,100. Coincidentally, that auditorium and the podium I used that day was the same auditorium and podium that I used to preside over high school assemblies when I was student council president nearly 40 years earlier. And two of my McAlester High School classmates are sitting right over here. They surprised me by coming today. But then we whittled it down and then began jury selection. Here's what you need to keep in mind about jury being a juror. The test is not have you heard about the case, because in this case everybody had heard about the Oklahoma City bombing case, all 1,000 jurors. The test is, under your oath as a juror, can you set aside everything you've heard and read and promise me that under your oath that you will decide this case based only on the law and evidence presented in the courtroom, the evidence you hear that is admitted for your consideration, and the law that the judge gives you at the end of the trial? Can you base your verdict only on the law and evidence presented in the courtroom, set aside everything else? And we found 18 people who, under their oath, could answer that question, yes. Now, we ended up going through all 6 alternates in 4 months for various reasons. Nolan and I could spend a long time talking about the first 3 we lost. A real serious problem with the attention of the lawyers to some things. But we ended up and then we lost a couple for health reasons and family reasons. So at the end, we were down to 12 jurors. And if I lost another one, then we're done. It's a mistrial. You start all over again. And so I was on the edge of my seat at that point when it's kind of like, driving down the road on thin, bald
You have
tires.
used the words end and seat to lead into the story of the 12th juror,
Yeah.
right?
So, yes. So we have 12 jurors. I can't lose another one. And they're deliberating and I get word that one of the jurors needs to see me. She has a serious health problem. So I got permission from the lawyers to visit with her privately. She tells me, Judge, I've got a terrible, terrible hemorrhoid problem. And she said, I am in terrible pain. I cannot go on. And I've had this happen to me before, and this, I can't go on. And I was thinking to myself, yes, woman, you're going to go on. You just don't know. And so I said, what can I do? Because I can't lose you. What can I do? And she said, well, if I can get some medicine and if I can lay down. And like I said, I'd presided over more than 500 jury trials, and I'd never had a juror need to lay down. But I was going to do anything. So I sent the police department to the local drugstore to get Preparation H. And then in my chambers at the Pittsburgh County Courthouse, I had an old, it had been in there apparently since statehood, an old called a fainting couch, a leather, beautiful piece of furniture called a fainting couch. I'd never used it. It just sat there. Well, I used it. We moved it to the jury room, and I met with the other jurors with the permission of the lawyers out of their hearing and told the jurors, y'all are going to have to let Ms. What's-her-name lay down and give her a break if she needs to. And that's what we did. And she laid down during deliberation, and she used the Preparation H, and we made it through to the close.
And the police officer used his own cash.
And the police officer used his own cash, and so later I signed a court fund claim to reimburse him, and the court fund claim, Mr. Court Clerk, says Preparation H. So, I mean, there's a district judge sitting back there, and I doubt if she's ever filed a court claim. Yeah.
Wow.
In talking about things that are unprecedented in the courtroom, you took the opportunity several times to come from behind the bench to address the jury.
Just one time.
Talk about that and what,
Pat,
why.
Pat got it.
There's a sketch in the book of it.
Yeah, Pat got it. As I said, I'd presided over more than 500 jury trials. I had never left the bench to instruct the jury. But we got to a point, and Nolan will remember this, we got to a point where there was a lot of chatter around the courthouse. The jurors coming and going. There were people trying to, people talking, and there was stuff going on that I had to put a stop to. And I had to impress on the jurors that they cannot talk to anybody. They can't even talk about the weather with anybody as they're coming and going. And so I thought, Taylor, how am I going to impress on these people? And so I hadn't planned to do this, but I just got up in my robe off the bench, stepped down off the bench, and went down onto the floor of the well of the courtroom and stood in front of the jury box as if I were making closing argument and implored those jurors, you've got to follow my instructions. You can't talk to anybody about this. You can't interact. You can't even look at people as you're leaving the courthouse and coming and going. And I think it dawned on them, this is serious business, as the judge is down here getting in our jury box with us. And I think it made an impression. But I'd never done that before, and I'd never heard of it being done. But
I've never seen it. We've covered trials for 40 years. I've never seen it before.
And I've never seen it either, and I've seen a lot of judges.
You just do what you have to do in the moment.
What a story. Now, just as a reminder, if you do have questions, put those down on the card. We have staff who can pick those up. You just hold it up, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can.
And I hope somebody asked the question of Judge Taylor about his conversations with the jurors after, because many, many, many people in this state were disappointed that Terry Nichols was not given the death penalty. Hey, I've looked over the evidence. He certainly deserved it, but it's an interesting story of what Judge found out about those.
I'll do it quickly. After everything was over, all the proceedings, we were finished with everything, I had an opportunity to talk to all the jurors. And what I found, Nolan's already referred to it, what I found was they were deadlocked 7-5 on the death penalty. 7 of them wanted the death penalty. 5 of them were for life without parole. And what all those jurors told me was, in all their discussions and everything, the 5 that were holding out for life without parole considered it to be a harsher punishment. The defendant was a healthy 49-year-old guy, and they considered life without parole to be harsher than the death penalty. And he's sitting in solitary confinement today as we're all sitting here all these years later, and so he may well agree with those 5 jurors that it's pretty damn harsh.
Bob, I have a question for you. 30 years this Saturday. Why write the book now? And Nolan, I'd like you to weigh in on this as well. Like, why was it important to write this book, and why now?
Well, it's a story that hadn't been told, and people remember the federal trials more because there was a lot more. There was media there, from national media there for the state trial, but they came like the first day, and then they came back at the end. For the federal trials, they were there every day, so it was right after the disaster that the O.J. Simpson trial was, and the federal trials did restore. Judge Mace did restore confidence in the judicial system. But the state trial, it was in McAllister. It was hard for the national media to get there. They didn't come. And so it wasn't like it was a forgotten trial. It just wasn't. It just didn't have the attention and didn't have the retention in people's minds like the federal trials in Denver did. And it was an important story to tell. Again, because 160 people finally got some solace. 160 families got some solace that their loved ones, that there was a murder conviction involving their loved ones.
One thing that I learned from Nolan in covering it, I never knew that Terry Nichols attempted to confess. Literally had confessed in writing to his very active part. He was not just a follower. He was an active participant. But he wanted to confess with a nolo contendere, a no contest charge. And Wes Lane basically said, no, you have to admit responsibility for this. So that never went anywhere. But I know you had written about that, but I think the people, everybody I mentioned that to, nobody remembers that. So it's important that this really, really important, the longest, well, it's the largest by victims, the largest murder trial in American history, okay? 160 victims. And so it's very important for that story to be preserved for history.
Ms. Lopez, from one of our attendants, artistically, do you have a favorite sketch or sketches?
You mean for this trial? Because there's thousands of others too. Yes, I like. There's a particular one. The judge is in it. I was able to get a lot of time, and he didn't allow too many people in the room. I can't remember what it was. I don't remember. I'll have to look through the archive. But it's a good image of the judge really talking to. You were talking to the defense attorneys, I think, and the emotion in your face. I was getting scared because he was, and I caught it. That was my favorite one. I'm sorry, Judge. It's my favorite one of you getting angry.
Mary's been saying that for a long time.
Yeah, I don't get that very often.
This one is from our audience and directed at Judge Taylor. They wondered if there was any legal issue significantly more problematic than any of the others that kind of stands out.
There were, there's a group of legal issues, and that was the admissibility. There was a lot of evidence being attempted to be offered, and so there were a lot of admissibility issues that I had to rule on. Part of it was attempts to bring in other theories, conspiracy theories, other actors. We had hearings. I would have them in the evening so we didn't waste daytime jury time. We had one guy that claimed to have a picture of the bombing. We had to have a hearing over that. It was total fake, just fake deal. And of course we had the Midwest bank robber theories, the Andre Strassmeyer German theory, the John Doe #2, LOM City, Carol Howell. We had a whole parade of, trying to somebody else involved. And so I had to go through all of that and determine, because I had to be careful, because if I excluded, this is evidence that the defense was wanting in before the jury, and I had to be very careful, because if I excluded some evidence that later the appellate court would say, well, now, Judge Taylor, you should have let the jury hear that. That's reversible error, and the case is reversed and has to be tried over again. So I had to be very careful when I excluded evidence. I was excluding evidence that the defendant wanted in. And I guarantee you an appellate court looks at that very carefully when you exclude evidence that the defendant wants to get in. So those were difficult issues. But I can tell you I heard all of that evidence, and I can tell you I know all of the evidence in this case. And there is no competent, admissible legal evidence that anybody else was involved other than McVeigh and Nichols. Michael and Lori Fortier knew about it, and Michael Fortier served 12 years in federal prison for knowing and not reporting it. But the only actors in this case were McVeigh and Nichols. And McVeigh was sort of the macho guy. He wanted to light the fuse and drive the truck. But like Nolan said, Nichols, he was the logistic. He was the mastermind. He's the one that figured out how do we round up all the fertilizer from stores all over Kansas without attracting attention. How do we find det cord and C4? And he located a quarry, and a rock quarry, so they could break into it at night and steal the C4 and the detonation cord. Where do we find jet fuel to mix with the fertilizer? They ended up going to a racetrack in East Texas. Nichols was the logistic, lining all this stuff up, but they're the actors, and that's something that I try to make clear based on my knowledge of this case.
Judge, you were quoted in Nolan stories and in briefs or in orders. You told the lawyers for Terry Nichols, just give me something.
I did.
Over and over and over.
The prosecutors,
give me any scintilla of evidence.
The prosecutors were doing backflips in my courtroom because I was saying to the defendant, the defense counsel, if you've got anything, bring it to me. I will admit it. And, of course, the prosecutors are going nuts because they don't want any of this stuff in, and they're afraid I was going to admit it. But what I was doing is making a record, and the lawyers here and the judges will understand, I was making a record so that if there is any evidence, bring it on. And my challenge was met with 0.
And I always remember, too, that you ruled against the prosecutors at the time. They sure wanted – Nichols had gone off at a courthouse, called the federal government a usurping octopus. Very memorable. And the prosecutors wanted that in, and the judge ruled it wasn't in the time frame of when the bomb plot started, and it was too distant, and his motivation was to be fair, and he didn't let it in. So he basically had everybody mad at him.
That's when a judge knows that you're doing your job. Everybody's mad.
Well, for example, you ruled against the prosecution when they wanted to keep piling on the evidence of all 160 people.
Yes.
Very emotional testimony, and you finally said no. They all understand, the jury understands, you don't have to repeat this cause of death. You don't have to repeat all this testimony 160 times. So you cut them off too.
I did. In our business, in the judging business, it's called the prejudicial effect outweighs the probative value. That's the standard that judges use. Is the probative value is its value for the fact finder. But then if the probative value is outweighed by the prejudicial effect, then you don't admit it.
Justice Taylor and Bob, can you quickly give a few examples of some of the key evidence actually found in Terry Nichols' home?
I'd defer to Nolan.
Okay.
I would defer to Nolan knows that stuff better than I do.
Well, one of the key things was that it turns out that Terry Nichols had robbed a gun collector in Arkansas to finance the bombing. And he had taken the guy's guns, the guy's quilt. He gave the quilt to his bedspread cover to his wife as a gift. It was stolen. And it was right there. There was a fertilizer receipt for one of the purchases of fertilizer that was in a kitchen drawer. There were blasting caps taken from the rock quarry found in the basement. And as it turns out, years later, they went back and found more blasting caps after Nichols started confessing that he had buried. And there was a drill that they had used at the rock quarry, the steel stuff, that cordless drill that matched. They were able to. I mean, there was so much evidence against him. It was incredible.
And that comforter was one of the ugliest you've ever seen in life. There's a picture of it in the book. But he wraps up all the guns in it, and then he gives it to his wife for Mother's Day, wasn't it? I think, yeah. It's awful.
Okay. Now we have time for one more short audience question. We're going to have the book signing immediately after, and so if you'd like to stick around, you have a book to sign, then certainly we'll have time to do that. So this one is to Nolan and Justice Taylor. How easy or difficult was it for you to do your job during the trial, knowing, of course, that what Nichols had done?
I wasn't too concerned. I had some, they set up some security for me. I first said, what do I need security for? And the U.S. Marshals said, well, Judge, the quickest way to shut down a trial is to do something to the judge. That will shut the trial down quicker than anything. So I had security during the time. I wasn't worried about it too much. Nichols the defendant was in custody, and we had good security all over the courthouse. So I wasn't. I just didn't think about it, I guess.
Well, I've covered trials for the Oklahoman for 40 years, and trials at the Tulsa Tribune for a year before I went to Oklahoma. And it doesn't bother you as much, except for times when you hear such horrible testimony. Florence Rogers, and it's hard. You don't let it affect you during the hearing of it. There were reporters in Denver who would cry in the courtroom. They would have to lower their heads so that Judge Maish wouldn't see them. Now, I didn't do that, but when I was finishing my story, it would bother me, both in Denver and in McAllister. And reporters in Denver drank a lot to forget. I drank a lot in Denver to forget, and I drank some in McAllister to forget the horror of what you had to hear all day.
Wow. I'm not sure that's the note to. There's one more question. Do you have a question?
There is one more question.
Yeah, I don't want to end on that.
Ms. Lopez, most of your work was in the federal system. How did you come to draw this trial?
Well, like I said, I had a sister who was working in the bank in the building catty corner from the bombing, and I had a personal investment and wanted to make sure that I knew my style of art. Thank you, Judge, for complimenting me earlier, but my style of art was probably the most realistic of all the courtroom artists in our little family, and I'm one of the few left. So I wanted to be there to tell the truth, and I wanted people to recognize the people in the drawings. You can get some courtroom artists, they're good and they're fast, but you may not recognize who the people are because they're so fast. So that's why I wanted to be here and do
Hey,
that.
Pat, I think people would be interested to know, briefly tell them the trials that you have sketched
Oh, my goodness.
over the last 50 years
almost
now?
almost was 45, close to 45.
Okay. How can you be only 41 years old?
No.
I don't. The math doesn't figure.
Right.
Okay.
I think some of the other trials, and there are too many to say, but some of the other trials that come to mind are Waco, Branch Davidian, of course, Oklahoma City, and I had the Susan Smith trial. She's one that killed her
They
little
killed all the
boys.
children. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and then Andrea Yates, mother in Houston that killed her children. Let's see, there's so many, but that's any trial that you can think of or see, and you can Google Pat Lopez courtroom art, and you can see them all. But any that you can, in the heart of the nation, that was my niche. But I did do the Supreme Court, and I did both coasts at times. But in the heart of the nation, any major trial, that's what you would find.
Well, I was always impressed by
Her drawings look like photographs.
Thank you, sir.
Nichols. You just captured him being
Yeah.
pathetic person that he was.
Well, his family didn't like that. I heard from them more than once. But
Oh, really?
yeah,
Wow.
that was often a problem because I did do realism. Thank you, Judge, for your compliment. I would have family members coming after me. You can't do that. More than once, I've been escorted to and from the courtroom to be safe.
Jeez. Well, I do want to be mindful of your time. Just a couple of announcements. Of course, this Saturday, our remembrance ceremony, the 30th, and weather permitting, it'll be outside, just feet from where we sit, and we'll hear about that, I guess, probably later today or tomorrow, and we'll do what we can. It's Oklahoma, and so the weather kind of dictates what we do. But I think it's going to be an impactful event if you are able to, and with it being Saturday, I think we'll have a lot of people who wouldn't normally be able to attend. So we're excited about that. And then following the ceremony, it's Cox Communication Day, and thank you to Cox Communications. Free admission to the memorial for the Intel Essential. If you're in line at 5, you'll get into the museum. So you can share that with perhaps some of your friends who have never been. And then the following weekend, we have the marathon, the expo, the 25th and 26th, and races on the 26th and 27th, culminating with that marathon on the 27th. If you've never been as a spectator or a participant in any way, I highly recommend it. It's a really, really powerful community event. And I also want to do a quick shout out. You mentioned Simple Truths, but next month on May 21st, our next Better Conversation, we're going to have your co-authors. Yes, they'll be here to be featured in a conversation next month. And so I hope that you're able to join us for that. Of course, if you would like to purchase a book and you haven't already, we have some right outside of the door, right in the hall there.
And it should, let me make a note. It should be noted, all the proceeds from the book go to the museum, or to the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. All of the proceeds go to the museum. So it's not a commercial endeavor. It's a work of love by these two gentlemen, and all the money that's raised from the book sales is invested back in the museum.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I should have said, for the marathon, that is our biggest fundraiser. We're a nonprofit, and the existence of the memorial and how it's kept and the way the story is told in the museum comes from generous donations and admissions and the marathon. And so thank you, and thank you to the Hall of Fame, a great partner. And thank you to the Kilpatrick Foundation, who sponsors our Better Conversation series. We'd love to hear from you, and so if you would, while we get set up for the book signing, if you're able to use the QR code and take a brief survey, we'd love for you to do that. All right, we'll reconvene in just a couple minutes after we get the signing up here. The line will form along the wall with the food, right in front. All right, so we'll reconvene here in just a second. And of course, a wonderful thank you to our panel, and thank you for being here.